Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll get started. So this is part 3 of this video series. So before we begin though, I like to take a quick break to get some motivational speaking from one of my favorite kids on the internet.
Have you ever had a dream that you had you could you do you want you could do so you do you want him to do you so much you could do anything?
Whew. So have you ever had a dream like that? So, that kid's adorable. It's one of my favorite videos on the internet. That was probably me as a kid. I was always um, tongue-tied. Um, anyways, nice fun. So let's just do a quick review of what we covered last class. So we've always been talking about complete dominance. That's what we've been talking about. If there's a dominant, it almost masks the effect of the recessive. It's still there, you just can't see it because the dominant masks the effect. Incomplete dominance is something completely different. There's a blend. Red and white make pink. There's a blend between the two extremes, a blend between the red and white. That's where pink comes from. Then there's codominance, where they're both co-expressed. Red and white don't merge and blend. No. They're both showed independently. Red and white, so we have red and white polka dot. For cows are co-dominant, white and black. Some are just black, and they don't have that white, which gets co-dominantly expressed, right? Then we said there's something called epistasis, which is really complex, but that's where one gene alters the expression of another gene. You might have the gene for black hair, or you might have the gene for brown hair. Doesn't matter because you don't have the gene to deposit the pigment. Epistasis. Then there's polygenic inheritance, where multiple genes have an additive effect. We're not like this, right? Well, some of us are, but this is the way skin color works in our life, right? The way skin color works is this. You got this poor dude here. He only has, 0 or 1 copy of the dark skin allele. Then over here you get more until you eventually have, the most or pretty close to the most amount. That's also how height works. The more of these you have, the taller you are. The more of these you have, the darker you are. The less you have, the shorter you are. The less you have, the more pale you are. Then we said some traits are multifactorial. There's a bunch of different factors, not just genes and many different genes, not just polygenic, but the environment affects the phenotype. The sun plays a role in makes your skin color, darker. Maybe like this girl. The sun plays a role. The sun plays a role and dries out your, skin. You can undo that by putting on, lotion, putting on some cocoa butter, right? That's where the environment can affect your skin. You can decrease your risk for certain things by getting a vaccine and so forth. Homosexuality, like we said, choosing who you love, it's based off genetics and it's based off the environment. And also here, this plant, if it's in a blue acidic environment, it becomes blue. If it's in a basic environment, it's pink. This is where we left off now. We're left with one of my favorite things, a pedigree. So a pedigree is just a family tree, and it describes the interrelationships of parents and children. It describes their different relationships, right? So then we can look, it's almost like a family tree where we can see, oh, mom and dad, they have this disease, they pass that on to this. Mom and dad have a widow's peak, they have this trait, they pass that on to this person. So we can use that for pedigrees, which is really important. And we'll do some pedigrees. I'll guarantee you there will be a pedigree on the exam. So here it is. You got the grandparents. One has widow's peak, one doesn't. A square is for a male, and a circle is for a female. If it's shaded in, that means they're affected. This person has widow's peak, this person doesn't. This person has widow's peak, this person doesn't. Here's Grampy, here's Grammy. They then have a kid. Here's, mom, and then you got, auntie, here's mom, and then you got uncle, and then uncle, and then uncle, right? With this, you can see that, okay, this person has widow's peak, this person doesn't. And you can do a Punnett square to figure out what percentage the offspring will have of widow's peak. 50% of the offspring will have widow's peak. 50% of the offspring won't have widow's peak, which is what you can kind of see here. And you can do the same things here. So with this, you can look and figure out what is the genotype and what is the phenotype, and you can fill in some missing spots. So we can use a pedigree to make predictions about future offsprings. If we don't know, we can use statistics and genetics to figure out what the probability of these phenotypes are going to be, and then what their genotypes probably are. So some genetic disorders are inherited in a recessive manner. These can be mild or they can be life-threatening. So a recessively inherited disorder, that's where it only shows up. You only have the disorder if you're homozygous for the recessive allele. You only have it if you're homozygous recessive. If you have one dominant, you don't have it. If you have two dominants, you don't have it. So this would produce something called a carrier. Those are heterozygotes. They have the recessive allele, but they're phenotypically normal. Some people are carriers. They don't show the disease, but they have it, and they might have a kid that has the disease. So most individuals that are recessive, that have this disorder, are born because their parents were carriers. An example of a recessively inherited disorder is albinism. Albinos, right? That's a recessive condition that you have because of a lack of pigmentation in your skin and hair. You only have it if you're homozygous recessive. If you're homozygous dominant, you don't. If you're heterozygous, you don't. This is an example of an epistasis, right? They might have the genes for black hair, but, well, they don't deposit that color because of albinism. They don't deposit it because of an enzyme. So this is important. What is a recessive inherited disorder? That's where it only shows up in individuals that are homozygous recessive. So albinism, they only show a lack of pigmentation in the skin and in the hair. And this because of epistasis. They might have the brown hair color, but they don't show it. So that's just an example of epistasis. So here's a picture of that. Here's an albino, right? You know, very pale skin. Some of you might confuse me for an albino. And, you know, the real pale hair. I don't have quite that blonde hair, right? But this is an example of albinism. Here's this girl, this woman. She had this. This is her daughter. Or this is her son. I can't tell. Hadn't flipped around the baby yet. But this is her child. How does that happen? Well, technically, she could have, you know, mated with a really pale individual like me. And then that could be our baby. That's a really low chance, like 1 to 64, right? Most likely, this individual has albinism. And that's what that individual has. So this can actually happen, which is kind of interesting. These individuals are not albinos because they have at least one dominant allele. You only are an albino. You only have albinism if you have homozygous recessive, 2 recessive alleles. Your 2 cute sisters, they're adorable. She's adorable, right? But she has 2 recessive alleles. She doesn't. She might be heterozygous or she might be homozygous dominant. I don't know. So you can see that these 2 individuals are heterozygous. They're a carrier. This individual could never have an albino child. These individuals, they could. It's possible depending on who they mate with. But this individual, it doesn't matter who they mate with. Even if it's an albino, they can't have an albino child. So generally, if a recessive allele that causes the disease is rare, so if it's rare to be an albino, which it is, then the chance of 2 carriers meeting and mating is very low. Or the chance of 2 albinos meeting is very low. So if a recessively inherited disorder is rare, then it's rare because what's the chance that an albino carrier would meet up with another albino carrier? Most people aren't. Most people are this. And so it's not very common that they would meet up and then all of a sudden have an individual. Although it does become more common with this. Matings between close relatives. These increase your chance of having 2 carriers. It's not very common to meet another person that has albinism. It's not very common to meet another carrier. But then if you mate within your own family, then it is common because they share your genetics. That's why, right, incest is not, taboo in many cultures, and we have laws against it in some areas. It's just kind of taboo because, well, there's some serious genetic issues that can go along with that. Some of you, you don't care, right? You know the saying, if, incest is best, put your brother to the test. And I strongly urge you not to do that. Your brother, he may treat you good, but it's better genetically to mate with other individuals. There's a nice girl out there. There's a nice guy out there for you. This is not your brother. I just think that's best genetically because you're less likely to pass on these conditions, right? So incest isn't always best. Don't put your brother or sister to the test, right? So it's really important to kind of understand that. The problem is this: it's very rare. The chance of two carriers meeting is rare. Not anymore, right? We have dating apps, right? Like Tinder or, these different apps like, all these other stuff here. Or dating websites like eHarmony, right? Or my favorite, I think one of the absolute worst, Ashley Madison, right? This website is just, I guess you go here usually when you're married, I think is the idea. You go here when you're married and you try to find other married people to have affairs with. No, you're married, stay with your partner. That's a little crazy, but I guess that's there for you, which is kind of cool, but it's a little weird to think about. But all these dating sites, they then make it maybe more likely for you to meet someone, right, that has a certain condition. Because watch this. Something I actually took from these websites. Here's Kadir. Oh, what a nice guy. Here's his profile. Just your average albino boy looking to mate with a fellow albino. Hit me up. Then, here's Allison. Hey, y'all. It's Alan. Looking for albinos. Text me XOXOXOXO. This is a case where normally two albinos wouldn't come in contact, but now people go on social media looking for a fellow albino, looking for a fellow, dwarf or short person or little person to mate with. Things like this can actually happen. So it's kind of interesting. So this is actually becoming relatively more common because some people are actually kind of searching out, I want to do this. I want to have someone that has this. So they can kind of play with genetics because now we got some really cool websites, I guess you can use. So this is a pedigree. Remember, if you remember, the shaded regions are individuals who are affected. Here's he said back here, an example of the pedigree. The shaded regions are affected. The square is the male, and then the circle is the female. So here's this one more time. The square is the male, because males are square, and then females are round. So let's just do this practice problem together, and then I'm going to have you do one on your own. So, complete the pedigree for the recessively inherited disorder of albinism. Complete this pedigree. So let's look at this. If they're shaded, what does that mean? Do they have albinism or do they not have albinism? So think about it. If they're shaded, they are albinos. So number 1, number 5, 13, these are all albinos. I already know what their genotype is. What is their genotype if they're albinos? They all are definitely little a, little a. All these individuals here who are not shaded in, they are not albinos. We don't know their genotype. They could be homozygous dominant or heterozygous, but we can at least put a capital A on all of them. We know they at least have one capital. How do we know that? Well, because if they had 2 lowercases, they'd be shaded in. So now we can go in and we can try to fill in and try to figure out can we figure out if they're homozygous dominant or heterozygous? So let's start here. This individual that's shaded in, are they homozygous dominant or are they heterozygous, or do you not know? This, child number 7, is the offspring of child 1 and 2. So what is he? He has to be heterozygous. Why? Because this individual passed on a capital A. We don't know what this other thing is, but he definitely passed on a capital A because this individual can only pass on a lowercase a, right? So this person had to pass on a capital A. This individual here, what are they? The same thing. This person here, this guy got a capital A from mom, and he had to have gotten a lowercase a from dad. So now we know what these two individuals are. So they made this son, who is an albino, because he passed on a lowercase a, and then she passed on a lowercase a. In this case, 14, what is his genotype? Well, he got a capital A. It had to be from dad, so he has to get a lowercase a from mom. How about over here? What does this individual have to be? Just like all these, they got a capital A from mom and a lowercase a from dad. Over here, what is this individual? So now you got to look. Whenever you want to find out what an individual is, you got to look at their parents. We don't have any information on the parents. And then we got to look at their offspring. They had an albino child. Mom passed on albino. That means dad had to pass on albino, which means he is heterozygous. So now because of that, these individuals, we can now see, okay, what is this individual? Homozygous dominant or heterozygous? They are homozygous dominant. Heterozygous, because they passed on a capital A from dad. Mom had to pass on a little a. How do you know dad didn't pass on the little a? How do you know that? Well, mom can only pass down a little a. And if he has to have a capital A, so dad had to have passed on that capital A. What about this individual here? What are they? Homozygous dominant or heterozygous? They have to be heterozygous. Dad had to pass on the capital A because mom couldn't have, and mom had to pass on the lowercase a. So we're left with these here and these here. Number 2, number 15 and 16. We cannot answer that question. We don't know what they are. For 15 and 16, we know they got a capital A, but we don't know if they got it from mom or if they got it from dad. We don't know if they're capital A, or capital A, lowercase a. Homozygous dominant or heterozygous. We don't know. This capital A could be from mom. This capital A here could be from dad. They might have both passed on the capital A. One might have passed on a capital A. One might have passed on a lowercase a. We don't know. And the same thing here, we don't know. This person could be capital A, capital A. They could be homozygous dominant. They could be. Most likely, he's homozygous dominant, but we don't know. Because maybe he is heterozygous, and then only passed on the capital A 3 times in a row. It's not very likely, but he could have. So we don't know. It's very important you can do pedigrees. So when working with the pedigree, sometimes you might not be able to determine the genotype of an individual. If that happens, you put this dash here. This underscore. This, I think it's called a hap. Use a hap. You don't know. They could be homozygous dominant, or, well, they might be heterozygous. We just don't know. Sometimes you don't know, and you can figure out by having these mate with certain individuals, but we just don't know until we get some more information. So this individual number 2 here, she might be capital A, and she might be heterozygous. Although all of her kids, all 3 of these kids, are heterozygous, she could have a lowercase a allele. She could have a recessive allele, but just didn't pass it on yet. If she is capital A, homozygous dominant, well then there's a 0% chance that her kids would be albinos. If she's heterozygous, then there is 50% chance her kids could be albinos. So we don't know. We have to figure out from our parents to get some more information. So I'm going to give you a chance to complete this pedigree here. So I'd like you to complete this pedigree. Maybe draw this out on a sheet of paper, and then try to complete it and try to figure out what the genotype is for this recessively inherited disorder, cystic fibrosis. So write this out and try to figure it out. You definitely need to be able to do this for the exam. Before you do, I want you to take a quick look at this pedigree. Do you notice anything weird about it? I'll give you a second. Look at the pedigree. Do you notice anything weird? Yeah. Mom, dad, brother, sister, brother. What do these lines mean? That means brother and sister had babies. And then Sissy over here also had babies with her brother over here. And they had 2 children. So kind of crazy to think about. That's why, like I told you, incest is not always best. Don't put your brother to the test. Don't put your sister to the test. Right? They may look good. They may treat you well. But genetically, it's not a great idea. So anyways, I suggest you pause this video and then try to complete this pedigree on your own. You want to make sure you can do it. Don't just follow through with me and say, oh yeah, this makes sense, I can definitely do it. I know you won't be able to. So you need to do this on your own and learn from your mistakes and figure out how this happens. These pedigrees, they seem really easy. They're not. They can be very complex. And you might accidentally put that you know something you don't or get confused. So make sure you do it. So I'll give you a second, pause it, and then you can press play soon. Okay, so let's complete the pedigree. So what we know instantly is this person, this person, this person, all these filled in ones, they have the condition. That means they have cystic fibrosis. That means they have to be homozygous recessive. These individuals, they don't have cystic fibrosis, which means they have to have one dominant allele, and we don't know yet. And we can try to figure it out. Well, this guy had children which had cystic fibrosis, which means mommy passed on a lowercase f, dad passed on a lowercase f as well, which means he is heterozygous. Crap. This individual here is heterozygous as well because mom or dad passed on a capital F, mom had to pass on the lowercase f. Now for the last one, this individual, what are they? Do we know? Yes. They had to have gotten the capital F from dad, and they had to have gotten the lowercase f from mom. So this is a case where we can completely fill in this pedigree. This is why, like I told you, incest is not good in this case, because this family is rampantly spreading cystic fibrosis. If it was albinism, they'd be rampantly spreading albinism, because 2 individual cystic fibrosis are mating, and they're always 100% of their children will have cystic fibrosis. If these 2 individuals mate, right, 50% of their offspring will have cystic fibrosis, 50% won't. But the 50% that won't, they're gonna be a carrier. So make sure you think about it genetically. It's not the best option. Some disorders are dominantly inherited, right? These are conditions which show up when the individual has a dominant allele. The dominant allele sometimes could cause a lethal disease, right? Those can't be inherited. Why? Well, because if you have the disease, you die, right? So you just can't live to pass it on. So some cause a lethal disease, and those are really rare because they tend to die, which is why they're rare. And they appear by random mutations. Not all of them cause death, right? An example is achondroplasia. This is an example achondroplasia is the most common cause of dwarfism. This occurs by the presence of a rare dominant allele. Polydactyly is a dominantly inherited disorder. If you just have one dominant trait, that means you have the disorder. Most of us don't. If we don't, the most common one is the wild type. Anything else other than that is the mutant. So achondroplasia, the most common cause of dwarfism. Here's a dwarf. That's what they call it. And now I think the official term you're supposed to use is little person or little people. Dwarf is kind of, has a bad connotation. But here, you can see that. And you can do a pedigree to kind of figure out if you have a dwarf with this heterozygous, what's the offspring chance and so forth. So achondroplasia, the most common cause of dwarfism. It happens because of one dominant allele. If they have 2, then they have 2 and they're still a dwarf. The only way you're not a dwarf, I'm not a dwarf because I have 2 of these recessive traits. I do not have it. So think about it. Is it possible for 2 parents with achondroplasia to have a son of normal height? Do pedigrees yourself. Is it possible for 2 parents with achondroplasia to have a son with normal height? Do I have a child or daughter with normal height? Is it possible if both have achondroplasia? The answer is yes. If you have two dwarfs mate that are heterozygous, well, there'd be a 3-to-1 relationship. 75% of the children would be dwarfs, 25% wouldn't. If one of the parents are homozygous dominant, well, then all the parents, all the offspring would be dwarfs. Here's a picture of that. You have this dwarf family, the mother, father and mother. They then have these 4 children. 2 of them are dwarfs, 2 of them aren't. We already know the genotype of these individuals. What's their genotype? Are they homozygous dominant? No, because if they were, 100% of the offspring would be dwarfs, right? So both these mom and dad are heterozygous. They have a 25% chance of having an offspring that is a dwarf. So they maybe had 4 kids. Luckily, instead of having 3 of the kids being dwarfs, only 2 of them were. Actually, this kid isn't a dwarf either. So I guess 75% of their offspring were dwarfs, which is or 25% were dwarfs. So this looks kind of interesting here that 2 dwarfs can actually have a normal height child. So this is important that you got to look, and sometimes you should go to a genetic counselor, like I've said. If you want to become a parent, you're concerned about some kind of family history, you know you have hemophilia, you know you have cystic fibrosis, and you don't know what your partner has, you can then kind of figure it out, try to do pedigrees. The genetic counselors can do that. Look at your DNA, use family histories, and you can see. But if you are homozygous dominant for dwarfism, and so is your partner, or if your partner is heterozygous, all of your offspring will be dwarfs. In this case, if you and your partner both have cystic fibrosis, all of your offspring will have cystic fibrosis. So you're guaranteed all of your children to have it. So you got to look at this, and you can do some genetic counseling, and maybe they have some alternatives, and they do, which they can try to help prevent this from happening in your child. For with all these growing number of diseases, we can look and we can identify carriers, and we can make some really important decisions, informed decisions about having children. So some things we screen for originally at birth, like PKU, phenylketonuria. We're not really going to talk about that, but now we do a lot of screenings at birth to kind of find some things out because we want to treat it early on and make sure we don't have these certain kind of conditions. So here's a nice pedigree practice problem, which I'll encourage you to do on your own time. So do that whenever you get a chance, and you can kind of look at the results and kind of hopefully kind of understand what that means. So we're going to keep on trucking along on the next video. So this will be the end to part 3, and then we'll pick up next episode, next video to see what happens next. So this is the end of part 3. Hope you're enjoying your break. Hopefully you're not dead yet because of the storm.